Hey everyone, tonight we're going to dive into the real story of how humans spread across the planet. It's something we often take for granted, this idea that people gradually left Africa and settled the rest of the world. That's what most of us learned in school, that Africa was the cradle of our species, and from there civilization slowly radiated outward. And that much is true. The very first Homo sapiens, our own species, emerged in Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago. But here's the part we don't usually hear. We didn't leave Africa once, we left over and over again, and almost every time we failed. The humans who first walked out of Africa 200,000 years ago aren't our ancestors, they're ghosts, dead ends. The real story of human migration is littered with extinction, near misses and populations that simply vanished. Before we get started, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss future deep dives into hidden history. If you could step back 300,000 years, the world would feel strangely familiar and yet deeply alien. Across Africa, you wouldn't find just one type of human, but several. Fossil beds tell us of strange neighbours, robust Homo naledi hiding in South African caves, long-limbed Homo heidelbergensis shaping crude tools, and our own species Homo sapiens slowly emerging. It wasn't a world where we stood alone, it was more like a crowded family reunion, with distant cousins sharing the same landscapes. Some looked like us, others didn't, but all were experimenting with fire, tools, and survival strategies. The idea that Homo sapiens arose in a single place, from a single moment, was once the cornerstone of anthropology. For decades, textbooks told us we came from East Africa, maybe near the Great Rift Valley, about 200,000 years ago. But that story cracked open in 2017, when fossils from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco were redated. Suddenly, our species wasn't 200,000 years old, it was 300,000, and not in East Africa, but North Africa. That single discovery widened our origins dramatically. It suggested we didn't spring from one Eden, but many interconnected groups scattered across the continent. Some call this the Pan-African model, others see it as a puzzle of shifting populations. What's certain is that our birth was more complex, more networked, and far less linear than we once believed. With origins that old, it was inevitable we would start looking outward. Africa was vast, but curiosity and survival pushed humans toward the unknown. And yet, those first wanderers rarely lasted. Around 270,000 years ago, traces of early Homo sapiens appear in Eurasia. These are controversial fragments, stone tools and a few teeth, that suggest our ancestors ventured out far earlier than anyone thought. But if they did, their story ended quickly. These people didn't thrive, they left no descendants, it was a false start. Then, 200,000 years ago, a second attempt. Fossil evidence places small groups of sapiens beyond Africa again, possibly into the Levant. They stood on new soil, looked up at the same moon we see today, and may have believed they were the beginning of something, but they weren't. These early pioneers disappeared, erased by climate shifts or competition. Their genes never flowed into ours. They were yet another branch pruned from the tree. One of the most haunting episodes comes from about 130,000 years ago, in what is now Israel. In the caves of Skul and Kafse, archaeologists uncovered burials of modern humans. These people lived and died far outside Africa, long before our supposed Great Migration. They buried their dead with care, suggesting symbolic thought, perhaps even belief in an afterlife. For a moment it seemed like humanity had taken root in the Middle East, but then they were gone. No living humans today carry their bloodlines. Their existence was real, their disappearance absolute. They were a parallel humanity that almost, but not quite, made it. The Arabian Peninsula tells a similar story. Around 100,000 years ago, shifting climates transformed what is now desert into a green world of rivers and lakes. During this window, humans poured across from Africa. Tools found at Jebel Faya in modern-day United Arab Emirates look strikingly similar to those from Africa's Middle Stone Age. It was another expansion, another chance, and yet, once again, the line ended. When the climate swung back to aridity, these populations collapsed. Some may have retreated back into Africa. Others likely perished. Each of these failed dispersals reminds us of how precarious our species was. Survival wasn't guaranteed, even for groups bold enough to step into new lands. We think of migration as progress, but in reality it was gamble after gamble, most of them lost. The ghosts of School, Kafze and Jebel Faya stand as silent warnings. Leaving Africa was possible, but staying out was almost impossible. And still the urge persisted. Something in us kept pushing outward, despite repeated collapse. Each wave added experience, maybe even subtle genetic and cultural shifts that would one day tip the balance. The humans who finally succeeded 70,000 years ago weren't the first or the bravest. They were simply the ones who managed to survive where so many others had failed. The repeated failures to leave Africa weren't just accidents. They were often written into the climate itself. The Sahara, which we think of as the largest desert in the world, wasn't always a desert. Every 20,000 years or so, shifts in the Earth's orbit changed rainfall patterns. For centuries at a time, the Sahara transformed into a green corridor, filled with rivers, lakes, and grasslands. During those windows, humans could walk out of Africa with relative ease. Then, as the rain shifted back, the Sahara dried and closed the door again. Populations caught outside the continent suddenly found themselves cut off, surrounded by deserts and ice, unable to return and unable to survive. Some scholars call this the climate pump of migration, Africa breathing people out and then pulling them back in. This explains why the genetic record shows bursts of movement followed by silence. Our DNA preserves a kind of fossil memory. In the mitochondrial DNA, which passes only from mothers to children, scientists have traced a common ancestor who lived about 150,000 years ago. She's often called mitochondrial Eve, not the first woman, but the woman whose line alone survived to the present. On the other side, the Y chromosome tells a different story. The most recent common male ancestor, sometimes called Y chromosome Adam, lived around 200,000 years ago. Why the gap? It may be that male and female lineages experienced different bottlenecks, or perhaps entire populations carrying other lineages died out, leaving only a narrow thread of survivors. Either way, the picture that emerges is one of fragility. Humanity, for much of its early history, was always on the brink of erasure, and then came an event that almost erased us entirely. 74,000 years ago, in what is now Indonesia, the Toba supervolcano erupted. It was one of the largest volcanic events of the last 2 million years. Ash rained down across continents. Sulfur filled the skies, blocking sunlight, plunging the world into what some call a volcanic winter. Crops failed, ecosystems collapsed, and for humanity the effect was devastating. Genetic evidence suggests our numbers may have dropped to as few as 3,000 to 10,000 individuals, the size of a small town. Imagine it, all of humanity reduced to a handful of scattered bands, clinging to survival in Africa and parts of Asia, while their cousins outside Africa were extinguished. It's hard to comprehend how close we came to being nothing more than another forgotten species, one more failed experiment in a family already filled with them, and yet, somehow, enough of us survived to carry the spark forward. Some anthropologists wonder if this near extinction reshaped us in subtle ways, psychologically, even genetically. A species that had nearly vanished might have carried forward an even stronger impulse to explore, to adapt, to gamble on the unknown. Why did some humans stay rooted in Africa, while others pushed outward, again and again, into dangerous and uncertain lands? One idea comes from genetics, a variant of a gene called DRD4-7R, sometimes nicknamed the pioneer gene. It influences dopamine receptors in the brain and is linked to novelty-seeking and risk-taking behaviour. Populations with higher frequencies of this gene often trace their ancestry to groups that migrated farther. It doesn't mean migration was inevitable, but it suggests that our very wiring may have nudged some of us toward the horizon, unable to resist what lay beyond. But courage and curiosity alone weren't enough. What made the final, successful migration around 70,000 years ago different from all the failed ones before it? The answer may lie in technology. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans had used fire, but now they were learning to control it with precision, to cook food that released more calories, to shape landscapes by burning vegetation, and to ward off predators. Stone tools became more sophisticated, hafted onto wooden shafts as spears or arrows, extending human reach and lethality. Early projectiles gave small groups an edge over larger animals and over rival species. These innovations didn't just help people survive, they allowed small, vulnerable groups to thrive in environments where they once would have perished. So when the climate pump opened the corridors again, a small band of survivors stepped out of Africa, armed with something their predecessors hadn't had: better tools, deeper cooperation, and perhaps an inherited memory of failure that made them more resilient. Unlike the ghosts of School, Kafze, or Jebel Fire, they would not vanish. They would leave descendants. They would carry fragments of other humans within their blood, for by the time they met Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other archaic peoples, they were already shaped by the ghosts of their own near-extinctions. The irony is that the humans who finally succeeded weren't the strongest or the most numerous. They were the ones who had survived catastrophe, bottleneck, and collapse. When they left Africa, somewhere around 70,000 years ago, they carried with them the genetic scars of disaster, the stubborn persistence of a species that had come perilously close to ending, and with them, they carried the faint shadows of every other attempt, the failed journeys, the vanished cousins, the experiments in survival that paved the way for their success. The stage was set. From this point onward, humanity would no longer be confined to one continent. We would begin spreading at speeds that defy explanation, reaching places no one thought possible. But that's the story of the next chapter, when our ancestors crossed seas they shouldn't have been able to cross, and settled lands that seemed unreachable. To reach Australia, humans had to cross 90 kilometres of open ocean. This was 65,000 years ago. According to archaeology, boats hadn't been invented yet. So how did they do it? The further we follow our ancestors' trail, the more impossible it seems. After surviving near extinction in Africa, small groups began pressing outward again. This time, they didn't just wander into nearby lands. They pushed along a southern route that hugged the coasts of the Indian Ocean, racing across continents in what seems like the blink of an eye. From East Africa to India, and then on to Southeast Asia and Australia, the speed of this journey still baffles scientists. At the heart of this mystery is a narrow strait at the southern end of the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb. Today it is a treacherous channel of water separating Africa from Arabia. But back when sea levels were much lower, it would have shrunk to about 13 kilometres across. Even so, it was never a land bridge. To pass into Arabia, humans had to cross water. Whether they lashed logs together, rode rafts, or simply waited for calmer tides, the fact remains. They managed an open water crossing tens of thousands of years before history says they should have known how. Once in Arabia, conditions were not what we imagine today. The Arabian Peninsula, which we think of as endless desert, went through green periods. Rainfall carved rivers through the sand and filled lakes that are now long gone. Fossils of hippos and crocodiles testify to a time when Arabia was lush and habitable. During one of these green phases, humans advanced across the peninsula, following rivers and game. Their tools, flaked stone blades nearly identical to African Middle Stone Age artifacts, have been found at Jebel Fire in modern-day United Arab Emirates. Dated to about 125,000 years ago, they suggest that humans may have tried to cross into Arabia far earlier than the timeline allows. If this was an attempt at migration, it failed, like so many before. When the rains retreated and the deserts returned, populations dwindled or disappeared. But even in failure, something remarkable happened. The template for coastal movement was set. Every time the climate opened a corridor, humans tried again, testing the limits of how far they could go. And when the door closed, some of them survived just long enough to pass on the knowledge of how they had travelled. This is where the story takes its strangest turn. From the Horn of Africa to the coasts of India is a distance of thousands of kilometres, and yet genetic and archaeological evidence suggests humans covered it in a mere handful of millennia. That pace doesn't sound dramatic to us now, but in prehistory it was lightning fast. Too fast, many scholars argue, for small foraging groups to achieve without help. Something pushed them forward, or pulled them, across terrain that should have stopped them. The coastal migration model imagines bands of humans walking beaches, harvesting shellfish, following tides, and sticking close to the edge of the land. In theory, this could have been a highway of survival, a way to leapfrog along the rim of continents without plunging deep into forests or deserts. But the sheer distances involved still raise eyebrows. Moving from Africa to India within 5,000 years would have required extraordinary adaptability and persistence. And then there's the water, At multiple points, coastlines break into islands. Some of these gaps could be crossed at low sea levels, but not all, which means somewhere along the way, humans who supposedly didn't have boats were crossing waters that couldn't be walked. They were island hopping. They were doing something our textbooks say they couldn't. That puzzle sits at the heart of the human story in this period. We know they reached Australia by 65,000 years ago. That's a fact, grounded in archaeology from Majid Bebe and other sites. But to get there, they had to cross the Wallace Line, a deep ocean trench that even at the lowest sea levels never revealed a land bridge. Reaching Australia wasn't just difficult, it was impossible without seafaring. As humans followed the coasts eastward, they weren't walking into empty lands. Other people were already there, people who weren't quite us. Neanderthals had been living across Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years, masters of Ice Age survival. For a long time, archaeologists thought our first encounters with them were rare, perhaps even hostile. But the evidence written in our genomes tells a different story. Every non-African person alive today carries Neanderthal DNA, usually around 2 to 4%, sometimes more. That means our ancestors didn't just meet Neanderthals, they lived with them, shared families with them, and left descendants who carried those genes forward. What's strange is that the flow of DNA seems one-sided. Hybrids survived when born to Homo sapiens mothers, but Neanderthal populations didn't absorb much of us in return. It's as if we expanded into their world, mingled for a time, and then watched their lines fade, while ours carried the mixed inheritance forward. And it wasn't just genes we carried away. Burials that show care for the dead, ornaments made from animal teeth, and bone tools all suggest that Neanderthals had rich traditions of their own. Some of these appear in sapiens populations soon after contact. Did we teach them? Did they teach us? Or did both species invent the same ideas, side by side, under similar pressures? The record doesn't say, but it shows a blending of culture as well as blood. The trail of our journey also passes through landscapes that no longer exist. One of the most intriguing is the Persian Gulf oasis. Today, the Persian Gulf is a shallow stretch of water between Arabia and Iran. But when sea levels were lower, it was dry land, a fertile basin the size of Great Britain. Rivers from the Tigris, Euphrates, and other waterways drained into it, creating a lush environment in the middle of what is now desert. Some scholars argue that this land may have been a cradle for post-African development, a kind of staging ground where small groups could grow before radiating outwards. Rising seas drowned it long ago, taking whatever evidence lay there beneath the waves. All that remains are hints, echoes, and the suspicion that one of the key chapters in our story lies hidden underwater. From Arabia and the Gulf, the next great milestone was the Indian subcontinent. What's extraordinary is how fast we seem to have reached it. Genetic studies suggest that humans arrived in India within 5,000 years of leaving Africa. For hunter-gatherer groups on foot, that speed is almost unbelievable. And yet, stone tools at Jwalapuram in southern India look nearly identical to those of the African Middle Stone Age. Whoever carried them across the miles knew exactly what they were doing. At Jwalapuram there's another clue, a layer of volcanic ash. It comes from the Toba eruption, the same catastrophe that nearly ended humanity 74,000 years ago. The ash lies above and below the tools, which means, if the dating is correct, humans were in India before the eruption, and some of them survived it. That survival story is still debated, but if true, it means that even as populations collapsed elsewhere, humans clung to life in the shadow of disaster on the Indian subcontinent. But the most daunting barrier lay farther east, the Wallace Line. Drawn on a map, it looks like an invisible border cutting between the islands of Indonesia. On one side, the animals are Asian, tigers, elephants, and monkeys. On the other, they are Australasian, marsupials, and giant lizards. Even at the lowest sea levels, when islands link together into larger land masses, this line remained a gap of deep water. To cross it required boats, not rafts of chance, but deliberate voyages. Still, humans made the leap. Sites in Australia, such as Majid Bebe, are dated to at least 65,000 years ago. That means that tens of millennia before we invented agriculture or writing, our ancestors were already seafarers. They reached a land that had never known humans before, carrying fire, tools, and ideas. How they managed the crossing is one of the greatest mysteries of prehistory. Did they build dugout canoes, or lash logs into rafts? Did they follow stars, currents, and birds, or did they stumble across by accident swept by storms? Whatever the method, the result is undeniable. They achieved something that should have been impossible. The coastlines they walked no longer exist. Sea levels have risen, drowning the archipelagos they may have used as stepping stones. The evidence is hidden, erased by waves. But the fact of their arrival speaks louder than the silence of the record. They weren't drifting aimlessly. They were navigating deliberately to lands no one had seen before. That's the revelation that reshapes everything. Our species, fragile and nearly erased by disaster, managed not just to survive, but to cross oceans long before we were supposed to know how. When we picture the first Great Migration, it's easy to imagine weary groups stumbling forward by accident. But the footprints they left tell another story, one of daring, planning, and skill. They weren't following coastlines blindly. They were island hopping through worlds that no longer exist, using boats we insist they couldn't have had. And somehow, against all odds, they reached Australia. In 2010, a team of scientists cracked open a tiny bone from a Siberian cave. It wasn't much to look at, just a fragment of a finger the size of a pebble. But when its DNA was sequenced, the results shook the foundations of human history. The bone didn't belong to us. It didn't belong to Neanderthals either. It was something else, a new kind of human no one had ever seen before. We call them Denisovans, and traces of their genes live on today in billions of people across Asia and the Pacific. What makes the Denisovans so uncanny is not only that they existed at all, but the hints of what they were capable of. In the same cave where that finger bone was found, archaeologists unearthed a bracelet more than 40,000 years old, made of chlorite and polished to a mirror sheen. A tiny hole had been drilled through it with such precision that even modern jewelers struggle to replicate the technique without powered tools. Whoever made it had an understanding of craft that seemed to leap ahead of its time. This was not the work of primitive survivors huddling in caves. It was the signature of a people with skills equal to, and in some ways surpassing, the Homo sapiens who eventually replaced them. The DNA told its own story. In Melanesia, islands like Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu, up to 5% of the population's genes come from Denisovans. In Tibet, a gene that helps people breathe in thin air is traced back to Denisovan ancestry. Even in Southeast Asia and parts of China, genetic echoes remain, which means that for thousands of years, sapiens didn't just pass through Denisovan territory. They lived alongside them, shared lives with them, and absorbed their abilities. Every time a climber reaches the summit of Mount Everest without oxygen, they are unknowingly carrying a Denisovan gift. Asia, in other words, wasn't just a highway our species travelled through on the way to Europe or America. It was a crossroads, a meeting ground where different kinds of humans collided, mingled, and changed each other. The further we dig, the clearer it becomes that our story there is anything but simple. This raises an awkward question. Why did humans reach Australia before they reached Europe? Conventional maps of migration assume that Europe, so close to the Middle East, would have been the natural next step. But the archaeological record says otherwise. By 65,000 years ago, humans were living in northern Australia, painting rocks, shaping tools, and lighting fires. Some of the earliest known art in the world comes not from the caves of France, but from Arnhem Land. Meanwhile, much of Europe was still firmly in Neanderthal hands. One explanation is that the southern coastal route was easier to travel than the cold steppes of the north. Another is that humans had developed a maritime tradition far earlier than we accept, one that gave them confidence to leap from island to island until they reached new shores. Whatever the reason, the result is startling. The ancestors of modern Australians established themselves tens of thousands of years before the ancestors of modern Europeans set foot there. As the genetic evidence piled up, researchers began noticing something else: traces of humans who shouldn't exist at all. When scientists compared modern Asian DNA to known archaic genomes, they kept finding mismatches, fragments that didn't belong to sapiens, Neanderthal, or Denisovan. These were markers of what some call ghost populations, unknown human groups that left their fingerprints in our blood but vanished from the fossil record. We don't know what they looked like, where they lived, or how long they endured. We only know that they were real enough to leave descendants. The discoveries didn't stop there. In China, fossils dubbed Dragon Man suggest another archaic population, with features neither fully Neanderthal nor fully modern. In southwest China, bones from the Red Deer Cave people point to a community with a strange blend of traits. Thick skulls, jutting jaws, but also tools and behaviour that seem modern. Were they late survivors of an older species, or hybrids we haven't yet classified? No one can say for sure, but they complicate the picture of Asia as a simple backdrop. Instead, it looks like a patchwork of humans, all experimenting with survival at the same time. And then, far to the south, on the island of Flores, something even stranger was found. Tiny skeletons, just over a metre tall, with skulls the size of grapefruits. Nicknamed hobbits, Homo floresiensis lived until at least 12,000 years ago, long after sapiens had spread across the globe. Imagine that. As the first farmers were planting crops in the Fertile Crescent, little humans still walked on Flores, descendants of an ancient line cut off from the rest of the world. Their presence was so unexpected that at first scientists thought the bones were diseased sapiens, but the evidence was too consistent. These weren't sick humans, they were a separate species surviving in isolation at the very edges of our awareness. When you gather all these threads, Denisovans with their mysterious craft, ghost populations buried in DNA, Red Deer Cave people, Dragon Man and the hobbits of Flores, a pattern emerges. Asia wasn't empty land waiting for sapiens. It was crowded with other humans, each with their own story. We didn't just sweep through. We entered a continent alive with voices, some of which may have lingered far longer than we realise. The truth is, every new discovery makes Asia stranger. For every fossil we unearth, there seem to be missing chapters we can't yet read. Ghosts in our blood whisper of people we'll never meet, while tiny bones in caves hint at civilizations lost to memory. It feels less like a migration trail, and more like a hidden theatre, where humanity rehearsed dozens of possibilities before settling on the version we know today. And the deeper we dig, the more it looks like some of those possibilities didn't vanish quietly. They may have shaped us in ways we're only beginning to notice. To understand how crowded Asia really was, you have to picture the world as it looked during the Ice Ages. Sea levels were lower by more than 100 metres. The shallow seas between the islands of Indonesia were dry land, forming a vast subcontinent scholars call Sundaland. From the Malay Peninsula to Borneo, Java and Sumatra, it was one continuous expanse of forest, rivers and coastlines. To the people who lived there, it would have seemed like the heart of the world, a place where countless species and perhaps countless human groups converged. The idea of Sundaland is more than just a map of vanished terrain. It suggests that early humans had room to expand, to experiment, to overlap with one another. Some species may have thrived in isolation on its fringes, like Homo floresiensis on Flores. Others might have flourished in its interior, leaving only fragments in DNA that still puzzle us today. When the ice melted and the seas returned, Sundaland was drowned, taking with it an entire landscape of human history. What remains now are myths of sunken lands, and the faint suspicion that some of humanity's earliest achievements may lie beneath tropical waters. Farther north, evidence has appeared that pushes back the timeline of when sapiens reached this part of the world. In the Tampei Ling Cave of Laos, archaeologists found a skull fragment and jaw dated to around 70,000 years ago. That's long before humans were supposed to be in Southeast Asia. It suggests that sapiens were exploring deep into Asia while Europe was still Neanderthal territory. Once again, the map we thought we knew crumbles. The pattern isn't a neat arrow of progress but scattered arrivals, some of which lasted, some of which disappeared, leaving tantalizing traces. Then there's the story of Beringia, the land bridge that once linked Siberia to Alaska. For generations, the textbook view was simple. Humans crossed from Asia into the Americas about 13,000 years ago after the ice sheets melted and opened a corridor. But genetic evidence tells a more complicated tale. It shows that a population of humans lived in Beringia for thousands of years, isolated from both Asia and the Americas. This standstill created a unique genetic signature, the marker that would later define Native American ancestry. These people didn't just pass through, they were shaped by the Arctic itself, surviving in a frozen refuge until the ice relented. Even more controversial are the discoveries inside China. At Deoxian in Hunan province, researchers uncovered human teeth dated to between 80 and 120,000 years ago. If the dating is accurate, it means modern humans were in East Asia far earlier than the accepted timeline allows. long before the supposed successful migration out of Africa. But this evidence has been met with silence, even resistance, because it threatens to upend the clean narrative of a late and singular exodus. Some have even suggested that political pride in ancient origins complicates the discussion. Whatever the reasons, the result is the same. A discovery that should have been headline news is instead left to gather dust in the footnotes. Technological puzzles deepen the sense that Asia was a laboratory of human innovation. Take microblades, tiny razor-sharp slivers of stone designed to be set into wood or bone to make composite tools. They appear almost simultaneously across vast stretches of Asia, from Siberia to Korea to Japan. Did one culture invent the technique and spread it rapidly, or did separate groups arrive at the same idea independently? The same question applies to pressure flaking, the delicate method of shaping stone with exact precision. It seems to emerge in different places at different times, as though the idea itself was contagious, sparking wherever conditions were right. Then there is jade, prized across East Asia for its beauty and strength. Carving jade is notoriously difficult even with modern tools, and yet artifacts from Neolithic China show a mastery that shouldn't have been possible with stone chisels and simple abrasives. Circular discs, intricate figurines, and polished blades appear without a clear developmental path. They seem to come fully formed, as if inherited from an earlier tradition that we haven't found. The techniques remain partly mysterious even today, a reminder that ancient hands sometimes worked at levels we still struggle to match. All of these discoveries, the drowned continent of Sunderland, the early human remains in Tampaling, the genetic fingerprints of the Bringian standstill, the suppressed evidence of Dioxean, and the sudden brilliance of technologies like microblades and jade carving, point to the same conclusion. Asia wasn't just a corridor through which humanity passed on its way elsewhere. It was a stage of experiments, collisions, and inventions. It was where humans met cousins we never knew we had, borrowed traits and ideas, and built technologies that carried us into new worlds. The temptation is always to tidy this up, to look for a single story, a single route, a single explanation. But Asia refuses to be simple. Every cave and every genome adds another voice, another presence that forces us to admit our history is crowded with companions. We are not the sole survivors of a lonely march. We are the heirs of a continent where many kinds of humans once lived together, fought together, and dreamed together. And the strangest thought of all is that some of them may have survived longer than we realize. Hidden in the tangled jungles, or in the myths of small people in the mountains, there might still echo the memory of our forgotten kin. Asia wasn't just a crossing, it was a meeting ground, a workshop, and perhaps even a graveyard of species we have only begun to name. For 200,000 years, Europe belonged to the Neanderthals. They hunted its forests, carved tools from its stones, and endured the ice ages that rolled across the continent. When our species finally arrived, it was as strangers on their land, and within a few thousand years they were gone. The official explanation is simple: we outcompeted them. Smarter tools, larger networks, better survival strategies. But the bones suggest a darker story, one marked by violence, cannibalism, and something that looks unsettlingly like extermination. Picture a Neanderthal camp on the edge of a valley, a small fire, children clustered in furs, adults tending the hunt. Into this world came groups of sapiens, leaner, more lightly built, carrying weapons that could strike from a distance. Archaeological sites in Europe tell us what happened when these two species met. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, Neanderthal skeletons show wounds made by projectiles, the kind of injuries that come not from accidents, but from arrows or spears hurled with force. One individual survived long enough for the bone to heal, suggesting repeated encounters, not a single clash. In other caves, the evidence is more grim. Neanderthal bones with cut marks, as if stripped of flesh, breaks that seem designed to extract marrow. Some researchers argue this was ritual or survival cannibalism. Others see it as a sign of violence between groups. Either way, it paints a picture of contact that was far from peaceful. Yet at the same time, traces of blending appear. The Châtelperronian culture, found in France and Spain, is filled with tools and ornaments that look suspiciously modern: bone awls, beads, pendants. For decades, Scholars argued whether Neanderthals copied these from sapiens or whether they invented them independently. Either possibility is remarkable. If they copied, it shows close contact and cultural exchange. If they invented them, it shows Neanderthals were innovating in ways we rarely credit them for. Either way, the line between them and us is far blurrier than we once imagined. Hybrid children make that blur painfully clear. At Lagar Velho in Portugal, the skeleton of a young child shows a mix of traits: the chin of a modern human, the robust frame of a Neanderthal. In Romania's Oase cave, a jawbone reveals a sapiens individual who had a Neanderthal ancestor just 4 to 6 generations back. These were not rare flukes. They were part of everyday life on the frontier between species. But for reasons still debated, hybrid males often seem to have been sterile, while females passed their genes forward. It was not a merging of equals, it was absorption on our terms. If we shift our view from bones to art, the story becomes even more tangled. In the depths of Chauvet Cave in France, images of lions, rhinoceroses and horses flicker under torchlight, painted more than 36,000 years ago. The sophistication of the shading, the movement captured in lines, is breathtaking. We assume these were the work of sapiens, but what if Neanderthals played a role? In Sulawesi, halfway across the world in Indonesia, hand stencils and animal figures have been dated to roughly the same time, or even earlier. Did these traditions spring up independently, or were they part of a shared explosion of symbolic thought spreading between groups? Europe was not a quiet replacement. It was a contested land, its valleys echoing with the footsteps of two peoples trying to hold on. Our ancestors brought fire-hardened spears and networks that stretched across hundreds of kilometers. Neanderthals brought endurance, strength, and a culture honed by centuries of survival in brutal climates. The meeting was not a single event. It was a struggle stretched across thousands of years, with moments of exchange and long stretches of violence. By 40,000 years ago, the tide had turned. Neanderthals were retreating, their camps shrinking, their populations dwindling. Our presence grew as theirs faded. Yet their fingerprints remained, in our genes, in our tools, perhaps even in the first sparks of art and ritual. To say we replaced them is too neat. The evidence suggests something far more human, a story of conflict, intimacy, learning, and loss. Europe, once theirs alone, was becoming ours, but it came at a cost, a silence that still lingers in the bones scattered across caves and rock shelters. Across Ice Age Europe, a strange new figure began to appear. Small carvings of women, with exaggerated hips and breasts, some faceless, others finely detailed. These were the so-called Venus figurines, found from France to Siberia, dating back more than 30,000 years. What they meant is still debated. Some say they were fertility charms, others that they represented a goddess, an early shared religion. What's striking is their spread. The same imagery appeared in distant places, as though ideas themselves were migrating faster than the people who carried them. Were Neanderthals part of this symbolic explosion? It's tempting to say no, that this was the mark of sapiens alone. But fragments of ochre and decorated objects in Neanderthal contexts suggest they too were experimenting with symbolism. A shell in Spain, stained with pigment, looks like it might have been worn as jewellery. In Gorham's Cave on Gibraltar, a crosshatch engraving carved into stone more than 30,000 years ago shows deliberate design. If Neanderthals were making symbols, then the divide between their minds and ours was slimmer than we like to think. While culture blossomed, the environment was collapsing. Europe in this period was unstable, caught in the grip of sudden climate swings known as Heinrich events. Ice sheets broke apart, oceans shifted, and temperatures plunged. For hunter-gatherers, even small changes could mean disaster. Then, about 40,000 years ago, the Campanian ignimbrite super-eruption struck. Centred in what is now Italy, it spewed ash across the continent, darkening skies and chilling the land. Some researchers argue this catastrophe struck Neanderthals harder than sapiens, who may have had larger networks to fall back on. Others think the eruption was simply one more blow to a population already in decline. By 24,000 years ago, Neanderthals were gone from most of Europe. But in Gibraltar, on the southern tip of Spain, evidence suggests a final refuge. Gorham's Cave and nearby sites preserve traces of their last stand. Here they hunted ibex, lit fires, and carved their enigmatic engravings. Some researchers think Gibraltar's mild climate gave them a few extra millennia of survival, a last pocket where their world lingered as the rest of the continent slipped from their grasp. Standing at the mouth of the cave, looking out at the waves of the Mediterranean, it's possible to imagine the final Neanderthals watching strange new humans arrive, knowing their time was ending. What haunts us is not only their disappearance, but the fact that we can still feel their presence. Every time a modern human child is born with a trace of Neanderthal DNA, it is a reminder that they did not vanish entirely. They live in our immune systems, our skin, even in the way our bodies adapt to altitude and cold. We carry their fragments, but their songs, their stories, their myths, those are gone. It leaves us with a chilling thought. We didn't just replace the Neanderthals, we absorbed them, learned from them, and perhaps killed them. Their culture flickers only in faint shadows, in beads, pigments, and engravings. If there were Neanderthal words, languages spoken around fires in dark caves, we'll never know them. Their voices are lost. Europe became ours, but not by birthright. It was taken, contested, soaked in the memory of another people. The bones tell us that the end of the Neanderthals was not clean, not inevitable, but the outcome of a brutal meeting between equals. And as much as we'd like to see ourselves as the victors, the truth is harder to face. We are their inheritors, living with their ghosts in our blood. In 2021, a dry lake bed in New Mexico changed everything. At White Sands National Park, archaeologists brushed sand away from a series of faint impressions. As the outlines sharpened, they realized they weren't just looking at random depressions, they were looking at footprints, unmistakably human. Some were the small, flat marks of children running and skipping along the edge of an ancient lake. Others belonged to adults, wide and deep, as if carrying heavy loads. Nearby, the tracks of mammoths and giant sloths pressed into the same mud, a frozen moment in time when humans and Ice Age beasts shared the same ground. There were thousands of these footprints layered one over another, recording generations of movement. But what stunned researchers wasn't just the sheer number of prints, it was the date. Using seeds and sediments trapped in the layers, scientists determined that these tracks were 23,000 years old. That placed people in North America 10,000 years earlier than archaeology allowed. For more than half a century, the orthodox view was that humans entered the Americas around 13,000 years ago. The Clovis First model, named for the distinctive spear points found across the continent, became dogma. According to that story, small groups crossed from Siberia into Alaska across the Bering Land Bridge, then poured south through an ice-free corridor as glaciers receded. From that single event came all Native Americans, clean, simple, elegant, and as it turns out wrong. The footprints at White Sands were not an isolated crack in the model, they were the blow that shattered it. But the battle to preserve the Clovis narrative had already destroyed reputations and careers. In archaeology, challenging Clovis First was professional suicide. No case shows this more clearly than that of Virginia Steen McIntyre. In the late 1960s, she worked at a site called Hueyatlaco in central Mexico. There, stone tools turned up in volcanic deposits that dated not to 13,000 years ago, but to more than 200,000. If the dating was correct, it would mean humans were in the Americas at a time when even Neanderthals were just beginning to appear in Europe. When she published her findings, the backlash was immediate. Colleagues distanced themselves, journals refused her work, and she was quietly blacklisted. Her career as a field archaeologist ended, not because she was wrong, but because she was inconvenient. Brazil gave us another challenge to the timeline. At Pedra Furada, rock shelters revealed hundreds of hearths, layers of charcoal, and what looked like stone tools scattered across floors that dated back more than 50,000 years. Local archaeologists argue that these were clear signs of human occupation, but critics from North America insisted the tools were just broken rocks and the fires the result of natural causes. Funding dwindled. For years, Pedra Furada was ridiculed as fringe, despite the persistence of the evidence. Then came Chile, where this site of Monteverde became the first undeniable crack in the wall. Excavations revealed wooden planks laid across boggy ground, stone tools, animal bones, and even preserved chunks of seaweed. The camp had clearly been a settlement, with huts and a central area for working hides. It was dated to about 14,500 years ago, nearly 2,000 years before Clovis. At first, Monteverde was treated with the same skepticism as Pedraforada, but the evidence was so overwhelming, so ordinary, so undeniable, that the field eventually relented. By the late 1990s, the site was accepted, and the once untouchable Clovis first model began to unravel, but cracks don't stay small for long. In Mexico, the Chiquihuit cave told another story. Deep inside, thousands of stone flakes and tools turned up in layers dating back as far as 33,000 years. The cave sits high in the mountains, isolated and cold, an unlikely place for long-term habitation. But the tools kept coming. Carefully shaped blades, cores and scrapers that bore the marks of deliberate human hands. Critics argued about whether they were truly tools or just natural fractures. Supporters pointed to the repeated patterns, the unmistakable flaking. If humans were in Chiquihuit 33,000 years ago, it meant they were not just visitors. They were living in the Americas during the height of the last ice age, thousands of years before the Clovis hunters were even imagined. Each of these sites, Hueyatlaco, Pedraforada, Monteverde, Chiquihuit, forced the same uncomfortable question. How many times did people enter the Americas, and how many times did they vanish, leaving behind only whispers in the earth? For decades, archaeologists clung to Clovis first because it was simple. But simplicity is not the same as truth. The footprints at White Sands remind us of children walking along a lake's edge, their lives as ordinary as ours. The camps at Monteverde tell of families drying seaweed, preparing food, building shelters. Pedraforada shows fires burning in rock shelters 50,000 years ago. Hueyatlaco whispers of a presence so ancient it feels impossible. These aren't accidents, they're chapters of a story we've been unwilling to read. The irony is that the Americas may have been settled many times, by many peoples, across tens of thousands of years. Some survived, leaving descendants that live today. Others disappeared, wiped away by ice, climate shifts, or later arrivals. Their tools and footprints are all that remain. The textbooks told us the Americas were a late chapter in the human story, entered only after Europe and Asia were mastered. The ground itself says otherwise. People were here early, perhaps very early, and their stories are only just beginning to surface. If people were in the Americas long before Clovis, how did they get there? The Bering Land Bridge explains part of the story. But when White Sands showed humans walking across New Mexico 23,000 years ago, it raised a problem. The so-called ice-free corridor into North America didn't open until thousands of years later, which means those footprints were left by people who had taken another route. The answer may lie along the ocean's edge. During the ice ages, sea levels were more than 100 meters lower, exposing wide continental shelves. Along those shores stretched what scientists call the Kelp Highway, an unbroken chain of rich marine ecosystems from Japan, past Alaska, down the coast of the Americas. Mussels clung to rocks, seaweed forests sheltered fish, seals basked on beaches and seabirds wheeled overhead. For groups skilled in harvesting shellfish and building rafts, the coast would have been a superhighway. A small band could have moved 10 miles in a day and always found food waiting at the next tide pool. But almost all evidence of this journey is gone. The camps they built, the fire pits they lit, the places where they pulled boats ashore, all drowned beneath the Pacific when the ice melted. Every now and then, hints survive. A campsite stranded on a coastal bluff, a tool washed up from a drowned shelf, but the rest lies under hundreds of feet of water. The highway that may have carried the first Americans has been erased. Genetics offers another perspective, and it's even stranger. When scientists sequenced DNA from Amazonian tribes, they found something unexpected. A genetic signature linked not to Siberia, but to Australasia, places like Papua New Guinea and Australia. This lineage, sometimes called Population Y, suggests that long before Columbus, long before Clovis, there had been contact across the Pacific. How could that have happened? Were there transoceanic voyages tens of thousands of years ago? Or does it point to an even earlier migration, one that hugged the southern coasts of Asia and crossed the Pacific before the Ice Age slammed the door shut? For years, this finding was brushed aside as an anomaly, but the more we study the genomes of indigenous peoples, the more the old story of a single founding population unravels. Instead, we see multiple threads: Siberian, Australo-Melanesian, perhaps even other unknown lineages, all woven together into the fabric of the Americas. Not all theories are so widely accepted. The Solitarian hypothesis proposes that Ice Age Europeans might have crossed the Atlantic, skimming along the edges of the ice sheets. Advocates point to similarities between Clovis spear points and Solitarian tools from Spain and France: the fluting, the precise thinning of stone blades. Could hunters have followed seals and fish across the frozen Atlantic more than 20,000 years ago? Critics counter that genetics shows no trace of European ancestry in early Native Americans, and that the similarities in tools could simply be coincidence. But the idea refuses to die. Every time a Clovis point gleams under museum lights, its resemblance to Solitarian craft keeps the question alive. Even setting aside the Atlantic route, the pace of migration within the Americas is breathtaking. Once humans gained a foothold, they spread southward with astonishing speed. By 14,000 years ago, people were living in southern Chile. Within another millennium, they had reached Patagonia, the very tip of the continent. That means in just a few centuries, small groups adapted to deserts, mountains, tropical forests, and frozen steppes. They carried fire into every landscape, hunted creatures as varied as mammoths and guanacos, and left stone tools scattered across thousands of miles. How did they do it so quickly? Some scholars argue it wasn't one wave but several, overlapping and feeding into one another, each wave carrying different traditions and genes. The Americas also hold traces of civilizations that history forgot. In the Amazon, when deforestation peeled back the canopy, satellites revealed massive earthworks, geometric enclosures hundreds of meters across built long before Europeans arrived. These were not random clearings, they were deliberate constructions: circles, squares, causeways, the outlines of complex societies hidden beneath jungle for centuries. Farther north in Louisiana lies Poverty Point, a monumental earthwork site more than 3,000 years old. Its massive ridges and mounds, aligned with celestial patterns, required millions of hours of labor to build. Long before the Mayans or the Inca, people in North America were organizing, engineering, and reshaping their landscape on a grand scale. Other sites pushed the timeline into the realm of the nearly unbelievable. The Cerati Mastodon site in California revealed bones of a mastodon that seemed deliberately broken with stone hammers and anvils. 130,000 years ago. The claim ignited a firestorm. Most archaeologists dismissed it outright. Surely the stones were broken by natural forces, not by humans. But the site was excavated carefully, and the patterns of breakage were hard to explain without human hands. If it is real, it would mean humans, or some human-like species, were in North America more than 100,000 years before Clovis. The very idea strains the imagination, but the evidence sits in museum drawers, daring us to explain it. When we step back, a pattern emerges. The Americas were not discovered once. They were discovered again and again by different peoples at different times through routes we're only beginning to piece together. Some of those journeys succeeded, leaving descendants who live today. Others ended in silence, their traces washed away by rising seas or buried beneath millennia of soil. Every new discovery, the footprints in white sands, the fires of Pedra Ferrada, the planks of Monteverde, the tools of Chiquihuit, pushes the date of arrival earlier and earlier. The old timeline collapses, and with it the certainty that the Americas were the final, untouched frontier. The truth seems to be the opposite. The Americas were part of the human story all along, written in journeys that stretched back far before the first Clovis point was struck. The mystery now is not whether people came earlier, but how much earlier, and how many stories we have yet to uncover. Imagine setting out in a canoe, no compass, no sextant, no GPS, and aiming for a speck of land thousands of miles away, and hitting it on purpose. That is exactly what Polynesian navigators did. They found Hawaii, a cluster of volcanic peaks in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, more than 2,000 miles from the nearest continent. Western explorers, when they first heard these stories, assumed it was impossible. They thought the islanders must have drifted there by accident, blown off course on flimsy rafts. But the evidence tells a different story. These were not castaways. They were deliberate explorers, charting the largest ocean on Earth with a skill that still astonishes us. Their story begins with the Lapita people, about 3,500 years ago. They left behind shards of pottery decorated with intricate geometric patterns, fragments that today serve as breadcrumbs across the Pacific. From island to island, archaeologists trace their spread by following these decorated potsherds. Within just a few centuries, Lapita villages appeared on thousands of miles of coastline, stretching from Melanesia through Vanuatu, Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa. It was one of the fastest and most audacious expansions in prehistory, rivaled only by the very first migrations out of Africa. The Lapita weren't just drifting with the currents. They carried pigs, chickens, and dogs with them. They brought taro, bananas, coconuts, and breadfruit. These were not random voyages of survival. They were planned colonizations. Every island they reached became a new home, reshaped into gardens, villages, and harbours. The archaeological record shows sudden appearances of entire packages of life, domesticated animals, plants, pottery, and tools arriving all at once. That's the signature of a people who knew exactly what they were doing. Where the Lapita themselves came from is still debated. Linguists trace their ancestry to Taiwan, where Austronesian languages first spread south into the Philippines and beyond. The similarities in language are striking. Words for stars, canoes, and navigation can be traced across thousands of miles, linking Polynesia to the Asian mainland. Genetic evidence, though, adds complexity. The Lapita seem to have been a mix, part Southeast Asian, part Melanesian, blending traditions from different worlds into a new seafaring culture. What makes their journeys extraordinary is the way they found their way. Without compasses or charts, they relied entirely on the natural world. At night, navigators memorized the rising and setting, points of hundreds of stars, building a star compass in their minds. They knew that when a certain star rose on the horizon, it pointed toward one island, and when another set, it pointed toward another. These patterns were memorized not as abstract knowledge, but as living maps sung and chanted through oral tradition. By day, they read the sea itself. Swells rolling across the ocean came from different directions. By feeling the way the canoe rocked, a navigator could sense whether they were drifting north or south. Birds gave further clues. Certain species flew out to sea in the morning and returned to land at night. Watching their paths revealed the direction of land long before it came into view. Even clouds carried meaning. Distinctive formations often lingered over islands, marking their position on the horizon. To Western sailors, the Pacific was an empty void. To Polynesians, it was a map written in the language of stars, waves, birds, and sky. The canoe was their instrument, the body their compass. These skills weren't casual knowledge. They were taught through years of apprenticeship. Young navigators learned by lying in canoes with their eyes closed, feeling the subtle shifts of swells against the hull. They memorized long chants that encoded the positions of stars and islands, reciting them until they could sail from memory alone. Knowledge was sacred, guarded and passed down within families of master navigators. Western explorers doubted these abilities until very recently. In the 1970s, a group of Hawaiians built a double-hulled canoe called hokulea, modelled on traditional designs. To prove it could be sailed without modern instruments, they turned to Mau Piailug, one of the last master navigators from Micronesia. Guided only by stars, swells and birds, he led the canoe from Hawaii to Tahiti, more than 2,000 miles of open ocean. The voyage silenced skeptics. Traditional navigation worked. It was not myth, but science encoded in memory and experience. The Lapita expansion transformed the Pacific from an empty ocean into a web of human highways. Within a few centuries, they had reached Samoa and Tonga, establishing hubs for later Polynesian voyages. From there, their descendants launched even greater expeditions, to the Marquesas, to Easter Island, to Hawaii, and to New Zealand. Each journey stretched the limits of human daring, but none of them were accidents. They were deliberate, targeted explorations carried out by people who trusted the sea because they knew how to read it. Still, one question lingers. How did they know the islands were there before they set out? No one sails into the void without reason. Perhaps they followed the flight paths of birds, or studied the drift of vegetation carried by currents. Perhaps oral traditions preserved memories of islands glimpsed by earlier voyages, stories passed down until someone dared to test them. Whatever the method, the fact remains, They reached islands invisible from their starting point, across distances that would daunt even modern sailors. To call it a miracle isn't hyperbole. It remains one of the greatest feats of exploration in human history, equal in ambition to setting foot on the moon. The Polynesians were scientists of the sea, their laboratories the canoes, their instruments the stars and waves. They took what to others was an endless void and transformed it into a world filled with signs, patterns and pathways. The Pacific wasn't crossed by accident, it was mastered. Sometimes the smallest clues carry the greatest weight. For Polynesian voyagers, one of those clues was a route. The sweet potato is native to South America, thousands of miles from the Pacific Islands, and yet, when Europeans first reached Polynesia, they found the plant already there, cultivated and named with a word nearly identical to its name in the Andes. In Quechua, it was Kumara. In Polynesia, it was Kumala. Language doesn't lie, nor does DNA. Studies of ancient sweet potato samples confirm their South American origin, which means at some point centuries before Columbus, Polynesians and South Americans met. The direction of exchange is debated. Did Polynesians sail east to the Andes and return with plants, or did South Americans sail west into the Pacific? Most evidence points to the Polynesians. They had the maritime tradition, the double-hulled canoes, the navigational expertise. It is easy to imagine a canoe gliding ashore on the coast of South America, its crew stepping out to trade, to share food, perhaps even to mingle with locals before carrying the crop back into the Pacific. However it happened, the sweet potato stands as proof of contact, a living fossil of a forgotten meeting between worlds. And the exchange didn't stop there. In Chile, archaeologists unearthed chicken bones in a site older than the European arrival. When tested, the DNA of those chickens matched breeds from Polynesia, not Europe. The discovery turned the question around. It wasn't just Polynesians bringing crops from South America. They were leaving animals behind as well. Chickens became a permanent part of the South American landscape long before Spanish galleons crossed the Atlantic. Once again, the story of a new world untouched until Columbus evaporates. The Pacific was a busy highway, and Polynesians were among its most daring travellers. But the Pacific wasn't their only frontier. Thousands of miles away, across the Indian Ocean, another migration unfolded that remains one of the greatest enigmas of prehistory. Madagascar, just off the coast of Africa, was first settled not by Africans but by Austronesians, seafarers whose languages trace back to Borneo. Genetic evidence confirms it. The Malagasy people are a blend of Asian and African ancestry, their culture a fusion of traditions carried across oceans. How did a small band of islanders cross 3,000 miles of open sea to plant their language and crops on the shores of Africa? We don't know, but they did. Rice, bananas, and other Southeast Asian plants took root in Madagascar, reshaping the island forever. The settlement of Madagascar is a reminder that the Austronesian expansion wasn't just a Pacific story. It was global, stretching across half the Earth. Then there is Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, a volcanic outpost nearly 2,000 miles from its nearest neighbour. Settled around 1,200 years ago, it became home to the iconic Moai statues, massive stone figures with elongated heads and brooding stares. Some weigh more than 80 tons, hauled across the island from quarries to their coastal platforms. How they were moved is still debated. Some suggest log rollers, others that they were walked upright using ropes and careful rocking. What's certain is that transporting them required immense coordination and social organisation. The mystery of Easter Island doesn't end with its statues. Recent DNA studies show Native American ancestry in the island's population, dated centuries before European contact. Just as sweet potatoes crossed the Pacific, so too did people, leaving their genetic mark on this remote island. And carved into wooden tablets found on Rapa Nui is something even stranger. Rongorongo, a system of glyphs that may represent a form of writing. No one has yet deciphered it. If it is true writing, then Rapa Nui is one of the very few places on Earth where literacy arose independently. That possibility alone makes Easter Island one of the great enigmas of human history. Not all islands endured. Polynesian oral traditions speak of vanished lands, islands that sank beneath the sea or were swallowed by storms. Some of these may record real geological events. Volcanic islands do collapse. atolls do drown as seas rise. The Pacific wasn't just a stage for exploration, it was also a stage for loss, with whole worlds disappearing into the waves, remembered only in chants and songs. Some vanished islands were built, not destroyed. On the island of Pohnpei in Micronesia stands Nan Madol, a city unlike anything else in the Pacific. Built on a foundation of more than 90 artificial islets connected by canals, its walls are made of massive basalt columns stacked like logs. Some of the stones weigh 20 tons. How they were transported and lifted is still unknown. Nan Madol is often called the Venice of the Pacific, but it feels more like a riddle carved in stone, a monumental statement from a culture that wanted to leave its mark on an unforgiving ocean. And at the farthest edge of the world, whispers of exploration hint at journeys even more improbable. Some old maps, like the Peary Race chart, have been claimed to show Antarctica's coastline free of ice. Polynesian legends speak of a frozen southern land, a place glimpsed by canoes that ventured farther than anyone imagined. Did navigators push south into icy seas, catching sight of the Antarctic before it was rediscovered millennia later? Drift voyages might explain some of the stories, but the consistency of the legends suggests intent. These were not wanderers blown off course. They were explorers probing the edges of the world. When we weave all of this together, sweet potatoes in Polynesia, chickens in Chile, Austronesian settlers in Madagascar, Moai statues and possible writing on Easter Island, basalt cities like Nan Madol, and legends of Antarctica, the Pacific transforms before our eyes. It is no longer an empty void crossed by accident. It is a vast stage for deliberate, systematic exploration. The Polynesians read the ocean as we read books. They saw islands where we saw only horizons. And with little more than wood, rope, memory and courage, they connected worlds that were supposed to be isolated. The Pacific wasn't just crossed, it was mastered. And in mastering it, humans proved something essential, that no expanse of water, no matter how wide, could hold us back. German researchers in 1999 probed the preserved flesh of Egyptian mummies in search of the herbs and resins that had once been part of their embalming rites. What they found was something that didn't fit. Deep in the tissues of bodies more than 3,000 years old were chemical markers for nicotine and cocaine. These plants grow only in the Americas. Columbus didn't cross the Atlantic until 1492. How could Old World mummies contain New World crops? The results caused an uproar. Some dismissed them as contamination from museum handling. Others speculated about Old World relatives of the plants that have since gone extinct. A few entertained the possibility of transoceanic contact, voyages long forgotten by history. Follow-up studies were inconsistent, sometimes confirming the presence of American alkaloids, sometimes not. But the question never went away. If the findings are real, they suggest that long before caravels sailed west, people had already stitched the old and new worlds together in ways we barely suspect. That's the strange theme of this last chapter. Journeys that don't fit, stories that appear at the margins then vanish. Some leave artifacts, others leave genetic traces. All of them remind us that oceans were never the absolute barriers we once imagined. Far to the north, the Arctic tells a similar story of disappearance and replacement. For centuries, the Dorset people thrived in Canada and Greenland. They lived in snow houses, carved haunting masks with wide, staring eyes, and hunted seals with quiet patience. Their culture was distinctive. They had no dogs, no bows, no kayaks. Instead, they mastered the art of ambush, waiting at breathing holes for seals to surface. Then, about 1,000 years ago, the Thule swept in from Alaska. They brought dog sleds, advanced harpoons and open-water kayaks, technologies that gave them a decisive advantage. Within a few generations, the Dorset were gone. Some scholars think they were absorbed into the Thule, others that they were pushed aside or wiped out. Whatever the truth, the replacement was shockingly fast. The Inuit of today descend from the Thule, but the Dorset linger only as shadows in artifacts and a few whispered legends of strange people who lived there before. Elsewhere, clues to forgotten journeys appear as anomalies scattered across continents. Off the coast of California, stone anchors shaped in styles used by ancient Chinese sailors have been found on the seabed. Were they dropped by traders who ventured too far east? Or are they later intrusions from Pacific crossings we already know about? In Mesoamerica, the colossal stone heads of the Olmec have long sparked debate. Their features, broad noses, full lips, have led some to suggest African influence. Most archaeologists argue they simply represent local physiognomy, stylized in monumental form. Yet the resemblance has fueled speculation for decades. Did African sailors cross the Atlantic in the deep past? In Kentucky, Roman coins have surfaced in fields and rivers. The official explanation is that they were dropped much later, brought by collectors or immigrants. But some insist they are relics of contact, coins carried across oceans and traded hand to hand until they reached the interior of North America. There is no clear proof, but their very presence gnaws at the edges of our tidy timelines. And then there are the Norse. Here the evidence is not speculation but certainty. At Lons-aux-Meadows in Newfoundland, the remains of a Viking settlement were excavated. Turf houses, iron nails, a spindle whirl. The sagas describe voyages to Vinland, a land of grapes and forests, rich and strange to the Greenlanders who sailed there around the year 1000. But how far did they really go? A carved stone in Minnesota, the Kensington runestone, claims to tell of a Norse expedition deep in the continent. Most scholars call it a hoax, but it continues to spark debate. More tantalizing is the Maine penny, a genuine Norse coin from the 11th century found in a Native American site. Was it traded inland through indigenous networks? Or does it point to wider Norse exploration than we've confirmed? Even the sagas themselves, filled with tales of contact, trade, and violent clashes with Skraelings, suggest a story of back and forth that lasted longer than a single brief settlement. What's striking in all these cases is not that any one artifact proves transoceanic contact beyond doubt. It's that taken together, they form a pattern. Everywhere we look, the neat lines we draw between Old World and New World, between before contact and after Columbus, begin to blur. Oceans were barriers, yes, but not impassable. Human beings have always been willing to gamble on the horizon. Some of those gambles paid off, leaving crops, chickens, coins, and DNA behind. Others ended in silence. The forgotten journeys remind us of how much is missing. The mummies with nicotine and cocaine, the Dorset masks buried in frozen ground, the Olmec heads staring out across millennia, the Norse coin in Maine. They are pieces of a puzzle we can't yet assemble, fragments of voyages erased by time, and they leave us with the haunting suspicion that the world was far more connected, far earlier than we dare admit. In the early 1980s, construction workers in central Florida were draining a pond when they noticed human bones surfacing from the muck. Archaeologists were called in, and what they uncovered was astonishing. Beneath the peat lay nearly 200 burials, preserved in extraordinary condition for more than 8,000 years. This was Windover, a window into a forgotten people. Unlike most prehistoric burials, the remains at Windover still contained brain tissue. Fibers of fabric clung to bones, revealing woven textiles far more advanced than expected for that time. Some of the dead were children, carefully wrapped, some even buried with small toys carved from bone. It was a glimpse not just of survival, but of care, of culture. And then came the DNA results. The maternal lineages of the Windover people didn't match the typical Native American haplogroups expected from a migration out of Siberia. Instead, some belonged to haplogroup X, a lineage found today in Europe and the Near East. The discovery sent shockwaves through the field. Did it mean there had been transatlantic contact thousands of years ago? Or was haplogroup X carried into the Americas in ways we don't yet understand, perhaps through an earlier migration? The debate still rages, but the Windover bog bodies remain an enigma, a prehistoric community whose DNA complicates everything we thought we knew. Modern genetics keeps turning up surprises like this. In Iceland, researchers identified Native American DNA that predates Columbus. The likeliest explanation is contact with Greenlandic Norse, who themselves had interacted with indigenous peoples across the Western Atlantic. That means some Icelanders today may carry the faint echo of a pre-Columbian encounter that history forgot. In the Amazon, genetic studies revealed something even stranger. Traces of Australian Aboriginal ancestry in certain indigenous groups. The distance is staggering. Thousands of miles of open ocean separating South America from Australasia. Did a wave of migration cross the Pacific tens of thousands of years ago? leaving behind only fragments in the genome? Or are we glimpsing the legacy of an ancient population that moved along southern routes before the Americas were even settled in the way we imagine? Other studies found African DNA in pre-Columbian South American groups long before the Atlantic slave trade. Again, the mainstream explanation leans on shared ancient ancestry, deep connections buried in prehistory. But the possibility of forgotten voyages across the Atlantic lingers. These fragments in our blood refuse to let the story stay simple. And now, with new tools, the ground itself is beginning to speak. Environmental DNA, eDNA, is transforming archaeology. A handful of soil from a cave can be sequenced, revealing the genetic fingerprints of creatures that passed through thousands of years ago. Neanderthals and Denisovans have been detected in caves where no bones were found. In some cases, human DNA appears in layers where artifacts are missing, proving presence that left no other trace. Imagine what this means for forgotten journeys. Entire populations that never left tools or bones might still be detectable in sediments, camps long washed away, caves emptied by time, islands erased by the sea. All may still hold the genetic shadows of the people who once walked there. Every teaspoon of dirt has become an archive. The ghosts of lost voyages are everywhere, waiting to be recognized. The pattern is undeniable. Isolation was never absolute. The Dorset were replaced by the Thule in the Arctic in a cultural shift so sudden it feels like conquest. Polynesians sailed to South America and back, carrying crops and chickens across oceans. Egyptians may have carried traces of American plants long before Columbus. Norse explorers left coins and sagas scattered on the edge of the New World. The Windover people carried DNA that still defies explanation. Everywhere we look, connections appear where we once insisted there were none. The forgotten journeys remind us of the fragility of the evidence. For every footprint preserved in white sands, thousands more have eroded. For every bog body lifted intact from the peat, countless others dissolved into soil. The journeys we can prove are only a fraction of those that occurred. And that is the haunting thought to end on. Humanity didn't spread across the earth in one clean march. We moved in waves, some triumphant, others extinguished, most erased from memory. We didn't conquer the world once, we did it again and again, through risks, failures, and leaps that defy reason. The real story of how humans spread across the planet is not a tale of inevitability. It's a saga of persistence, of people who refused to stop walking, sailing, or exploring, even when everything seemed impossible. The footprints we found are pressed into mud, buried in caves, and coded in our blood, are only the rarest survivors. Behind them lie countless journeys we will never know. And maybe that's fitting, because the truth of our species is not that we reached every shore, it's that we never stopped trying.